My boyfriend called me a stranger to impress the high school crush he never got over, so I quietly turned his fantasy girl against him and watched him fall apart. Weston looked me dead in the eye and told his old crush I was nobody. He said it so smoothly, so effortlessly, that it took me a full 4 seconds to understand what I'd just heard. 8 months together, gone in one sentence. I was standing 3 feet away, holding his favorite beer, a bottle of the amber ale he only drank on Fridays. I'd bought it on my way to his office happy hour because I knew he'd forget to eat and I knew he'd want something in his hand that wasn't a glass of white wine some coworker pushed on him. I walked into that bar with a bottle sweating in my palm and a smile already forming, and I found him standing at the counter with a woman I didn't recognize, and I watched his face do something I had never seen it do before. It went careful, controlled, like he was recalculating in real time. "This is just someone from grad school," he said, gesturing at me the way you'd gesture at a coat rack. Not his girlfriend, not even his friend, just someone. I went in for a hug out of 8 months of muscle memory. He stuck his hand out instead, formal, stiff, a handshake between strangers meeting at a networking event. I took his hand because my body didn't know what else to do. Her name was Sabrina. She had a glass of rosé and a laugh that carried across the room, and Weston was already turning back toward her before I'd finished shaking his hand, already laughing at whatever she'd said before I interrupted them by existing. I stood there holding his beer. Nobody took it from me. I held it for 11 minutes by the clock on my phone, because I counted, because counting was the only thing keeping me upright. And then I set it on the bar and walked out into the parking lot and sat in my car and didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I didn't cry that night. I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, doing math. 8 months of Friday croissants. 8 months of him introducing me to his mother over video call. 8 months, erased in the 4 seconds it took him to say I was nobody. That was the night everything started. But to understand why it happened and why it ended the way it did, you have to go back further than the bar. You have to go back to the beginning, before Sabrina had a name I recognized, before I understood that I wasn't dating a man. I was dating a memory he was still trying to rewrite. My name is Naomi. I was 26 that year, in the second year of a graduate program in public policy at a university I won't name, in a city I also won't name. Though if you've ever sat in a 24-hour study room drinking gas station coffee at 2 in the morning trying to finish a stats problem set, you've probably sat in a room just like the one where I met Weston. He was 27, 1 year ahead of me in the same program, and the first time I really noticed him was in October, at a study table in the library basement, when he slid a croissant across the table without a word, because he'd seen me skip lunch 3 days in a row. He didn't say anything clever, he just put it down and went back to his readings. I ate it in 4 bites, and looked up and he was already watching me, half smiling, like he'd been waiting to see if I'd notice. That was Weston in the early months. Quiet, attentive, a little awkward in a way that read as sincere rather than performative. He remembered which professors I was afraid of and which ones I secretly liked. He learned my coffee order without asking twice. He brought croissants every Friday for the rest of that semester, a tradition that started as a joke and became a fact of our relationship. Something so reliable I stopped even thanking him for it, the way you stop thanking gravity for keeping you on the ground. We started dating in December, 3 months into knowing each other. After a study group turned into a 2-person dinner turned into him walking me home in the cold and asking, at my front door, if he could see me again on a night that wasn't about exams. I said yes. I remember thinking, with the kind of certainty you only get to have a handful of times in your 20s, that I had found someone real, someone who paid attention, someone who noticed the small things because the small things were where he lived. His roommate was a guy named Miles, also in the program, a year behind me, easygoing and a little too honest for his own good, the kind of person who'd tell you if you had spinach in your teeth before you'd even asked, the kind of friend who remembered your birthday without a reminder and showed up early to help you move boxes. Miles liked me. He told Weston so more than once, according to Weston himself, who repeated it back to me with a kind of pride, like Miles's approval was a stamp on our relationship's passport. I should tell you about Sabrina now because she matters, but not in the way you might expect. Sabrina wasn't a stranger who appeared out of nowhere. She was a name I'd heard before Weston ever met me, a ghost who lived in the corners of his stories about high school. He grew up in a suburb 3 hours from where we went to grad school, and Sabrina Voss had been the girl 2 lockers down from his, the girl he'd carried a torch for from freshman year through graduation, the girl who dated the captain of the lacrosse team, and then a string of other boys who were never Weston, the girl who was, by his own admission, barely aware he existed. He told me this story on our 3rd date, over pasta at a restaurant near campus, in the tone men use when they think they've grown past something. I was obsessed with this girl in high school, he said, laughing at himself. Sabrina never had a chance. She didn't even know my last name until junior year. I laughed along with him because it seemed like a closed chapter, a funny anecdote about teenage longing, the kind of story you tell to prove you've matured. I had no way of knowing that night that the chapter wasn't closed. It was just waiting for a sequel. There was an earlier incident back in February, 4 months into dating, that I didn't think much of at the time, but that reads differently now. In hindsight, the way early warning signs always do once you know what they were warning you about. Weston's college friend group had a reunion dinner, people he hadn't seen in 2 years, and he mentioned on the drive over that someone named Priya might be there, a woman he'd had a brief thing with sophomore year of college. It's not a big deal, he said, hands tight on the wheel. Just don't make make it weird. I didn't know what don't make it weird meant until we got there, and he introduced me to 6 different people by name and title. This is my girlfriend Naomi. She's getting her master's in policy, and then reached Priya last, and simply said, Priya, hey, long time. No introduction, no mention of me standing right beside him. Priya glanced at me, confused, and Weston steered the conversation somewhere else so fast I almost got whiplash. I brought it up in the car afterward. He said I was reading into nothing, that Priya and he had history, and it would have been awkward to make a big production out of introducing me, that I was being insecure over a 5-second omission. I remember accepting that explanation because it was easier than not accepting it because he sounded so certain, and because 5 months in, I still believed that the version of him who brought me croissants was the truest version, and every strange behavior was an aberration rather than a pattern. There was one more early detail worth mentioning, something I didn't think about again until much later. In March of that first year, 7 months before Sabrina ever moved to our city, Weston mentioned, almost offhand, that he'd looked up her public profile the week before. Just curious, he said, about where she'd ended up after college. I asked if that was normal, checking in on someone from high school out of nowhere, and he laughed it off, said everyone does that sometimes, said it didn't mean anything. I let it go because it seemed like such a minor thing. A few idle minutes of scrolling, the kind of harmless curiosity most people indulge in about their past without it amounting to anything. I didn't know yet that it wasn't idle. I didn't know it was a habit, repeated quietly and often enough that by the time she actually arrived in our city, he already knew more about her daily life than I did about most of my own close friends. That's the shape our relationship took over that first year. Warm, consistent, occasionally punctuated by small moments where he seemed to disappear from my side in rooms that contained women from his past. I filed each one away as a coincidence. I didn't yet understand that Weston's affection for me was real, but it was also conditional, contingent on an audience that didn't include anyone who might remind him he used to be invisible. Sabrina moved to our city in June, a detail I learned secondhand, from a mutual friend, not from Weston himself, which should have told me something even then. She'd taken a job at a consulting firm 11 blocks from Weston's office. When he finally mentioned it, 3 days after I already knew, he did it casually, sliding it into a sentence about traffic on his commute, and I remember watching his face very closely as he said her name, watching for anything, and finding nothing except a stillness that felt too deliberate to be nothing. I didn't know yet what that stillness meant. I would learn. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The happy hour where he called me a stranger wasn't the beginning of the pattern. It was the moment the pattern became undeniable. The first time I couldn't explain it away as a misread glance or an awkward introduction. But once I started paying attention, once I went back through the months with clear eyes, I realized the escalation had been building for weeks. In small steps, I'd talked myself out of noticing. The first step came 2 weeks before the happy hour, at a work function Weston hadn't invited me to. I only knew about it because he mentioned it afterward, in passing, and when I asked how it went, he said fine, boring, nothing to report. I later found out through a photo one of his coworkers posted that Sabrina had been there. He hadn't lied about the party happening. He'd just decided, unilaterally, that it was the kind of party where I didn't belong, and he hadn't told me why, and I hadn't pushed, because pushing felt paranoid, and I didn't want to be a paranoid girlfriend. That was the ceiling. I told myself it couldn't get worse than being quietly excluded from a work event. Then came the happy hour, the handshake, the word someone. That broke through the first ceiling completely, and it should have ended things right there. I want to be honest about that, because I think people watching this expect me to say, I left immediately, and I didn't. I stayed, because he apologized that night in the parking lot, chasing me out to my car, saying he panicked, saying seeing Sabrina again after all these years had thrown him off, saying it would never happen again. He looked wrecked. He looked genuinely like a man horrified at his own behavior. I believed him, because believing him was easier than accepting that the person I loved had just erased me to look single in front of a woman from 10th grade. It happened again 3 weeks later. That was the second ceiling, and it broke faster than the first one had. Miles was turning 26, and he threw a birthday dinner at his apartment, the same apartment he shared with Weston, a comfortable, familiar space I'd been to a dozen times. Sabrina was there because she and Miles had stayed loosely in touch since high school, a detail that, in hindsight, is almost funny given what would happen to the three of them later. Weston left me at the door, not figuratively, literally. I walked in behind him, and he crossed the room towards Sabrina before I'd even taken my coat off. And when Miles, confused, asked who I was, since he'd clearly forgotten I was Weston's girlfriend of 8 months by that point, Weston said I was thinking about renting the spare room. They didn't have a spare room. It was a 2-bedroom apartment with a mattress in the office nook that Miles used for storage. Weston made up a lie so specific and so unnecessary that I stood in the doorway trying to figure out if I'd misheard him. Sabrina, at some point in the evening, asked Weston if he was seeing anyone. I was 5 feet away, holding a paper plate of birthday cake, closer to him than I'd been all night because he'd been actively avoiding proximity to me since we arrived. He said he was keeping his options open. 5 feet from his girlfriend. I set the paper plate down on Miles's kitchen counter and went to find my coat, and Weston caught up with me in the hallway, apologizing again, saying he didn't know why he said it, saying old habits habits die hard around Sabrina, saying he'd talk to her, clarify things, make it right. I told him there was nothing to clarify because there shouldn't have been anything to clarify in the first place. He nodded like he understood. I don't think he did. Not yet. The third ceiling came at the office barbecue, and this one is the step that finally moved me from hurt into something colder and more useful. Weston told me, 2 days before the event, that it was employees only, that I shouldn't come, that it would be awkward to bring a +1 to something that size. I said okay. I trusted him. Then, the night before, scrolling through his firm's public event page out of idle curiosity, I saw the flyer. +1's welcome. Bring your favorite people. I didn't say anything to him about it. I wanted to see what he'd do. He posted 12 pictures from that barbecue over the course of the day. Coworkers around a grill, a volleyball net, a group shot with his arms slung casually around Sabrina's shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. He liked every single one of her photos within minutes of her posting them, a level of attentiveness he had never once shown my own social media, where a post from me could sit for days without so much as a thumbs up. That was the moment. Not the handshake, not the fake spare room, not even the lie about the barbecue itself, but the sight of his arm around her shoulders in a photo he posted publicly. 12 images announcing to anyone paying attention that he was available, unattached, keeping his options open, exactly as he'd told her at Miles's birthday. I sat on my bed that night with my phone in my hand, and I felt something in me go very quiet and very clear. I want to explain Weston's psychology here because I don't think he was a cartoon villain, and I don't think painting him as one does justice to what actually happened. Weston wasn't cruel by nature. He was, I came to understand, a person who had spent his adolescence feeling invisible to the one person whose attention he wanted most, and who had built an entire architecture of self-worth around the idea that being seen by Sabrina would finally prove something about him that he'd never managed to prove to himself. He loved me, I think, in the moments when Sabrina wasn't in the room, but the second she was, some 15-year-old part of him took the wheel, and that part of him didn't care who he ran over to get where he was going. That doesn't excuse what he did. It explains it. Those are different things, and I had to learn the difference the hard way. I planted a detail in that period without fully understanding I was doing it. Weston had a habit, one I'd noticed months earlier and mostly forgotten, of leaving his laptop logged into his personal email when he worked from my apartment, because he trusted me and because he was, in most areas of his life, careless about privacy in the specific way people are when they've never been given a reason to be careful. I didn't go looking through his email that week. I want to be honest about that too. But I remembered that habit. I filed it away the same way you file away the location of a fire extinguisher, hoping you never need it, but glad to know where it is. I started making decisions differently after the barbecue. Not reckless ones, careful ones. I got coffee with Miles the following week. A casual thing. The kind of hangout that had happened a handful of times before without either of us thinking much of it, since Miles and I had become genuinely friendly over the months of overlapping social circles. Miles was sweet, single, and as it turned out, done watching his roommate humiliate me in his own living room. We didn't plot anything that day. I want to be precise about that, because there's a difference between what I did and what people accuse me of doing when they hear this story secondhand. I didn't ask Miles to seduce Sabrina. I didn't hand him a script. I mentioned in the natural flow of conversation how sharp Sabrina seemed, how funny she'd been at his birthday party, how it was almost impressive that Weston hadn't worked up the nerve to actually pursue her after all these years of hovering. I said it lightly, almost as a joke, the kind of comment you make about someone else's stalled romantic ambitions. Miles laughed and said something like, "Someone should just ask her out already." I said maybe someone should. That was the entire extent of what I did that day. I planted one sentence and let it grow on its own, in soil that Weston himself had spent months preparing. Trivia night came 2 weeks later. At a bar near campus that hosted a weekly quiz league, half our program had joined that semester. Weston told me he was going with co-workers. Casual, low-key, nothing I needed to worry about missing. I showed up anyway. Miles was already there when I arrived, and we sat down together at a table near the back, and I watched Weston's face when he walked in and saw us sitting side by side. His expression was worth every bit of what came next. It cycled through confusion, then something like panic, then a forced, brittle smile as he made his way over and sat down at a table across the room with two co-workers I vaguely recognized. Sabrina arrived 20 minutes later, scanning the room, and Miles waved her over before Weston had the chance to. I watched the whole thing unfold like a play I'd written, but wasn't allowed to direct from the stage. Miles bought her a drink. He made her laugh twice within the first 10 minutes. Easy, unforced laughter. The kind that happens when someone isn't performing for you. By the second round of trivia questions, they'd exchanged numbers. I saw Weston's eyes flick over from his table at least a dozen times. Saw him lose track of an answer he definitely knew. Saw him excuse himself twice to go to the bar for drinks he didn't need. He cornered Miles near the bathroom hallway before the night ended. I wasn't there for it, but Miles told me about it in detail the next day, and I believed every word because it matched exactly the kind of thing Weston would say when he thought no one was keeping score but him. "You know I've had a thing for her since high school," Weston said. "It's kind of messed up to go after a girl you know I've liked." Miles, to his credit, didn't back down. "You have a girlfriend," he said. "Why does it even matter?" And there it was, the fourth ceiling breaking in real time in a hallway outside a bathroom, with the man holding Sabrina's number standing 3 feet away. Weston panicked, the way people panic when they're cornered by their own contradictions. "She's not my girlfriend," girlfriend, he said. We just hang out sometimes. 8 months. Erased in one sentence. Again. This time in front of the exact person whose approval Weston most wanted to keep. Miles told me this the next morning over the phone, his voice flat with something between disbelief and disgust. He said you two just hang out sometimes, Miles said. I've watched you two for 8 months. I've seen you at his mom's birthday call. I've seen the croissants. That's not hanging out, Naomi. I don't know what he's doing, but I'm not going to be part of it. 2 weeks after that conversation, Miles and Sabrina were official. I found out the way I found out most things that mattered that fall. Secondhand, through a photo, this time posted by Sabrina herself. A picture of the two of them at a rooftop bar with a caption that said something about finally taking a chance on something good. I didn't feel triumphant when I saw it. I felt something quieter and stranger, a kind of grim satisfaction mixed with an ache I couldn't fully name, because even as I watched Weston's fantasy collapse in real time, I was still grieving the version of him I'd fallen for at that library table, the one who'd never existed anywhere except in the specific hours when Sabrina wasn't in the room. Weston showed up at my apartment door at 11 at night, 3 days after the rooftop photo made its way around our shared circles. His hair was disheveled in a way that told me he'd been running his hands through it for hours. He looked hollowed out, the particular kind of hollow that comes from watching something you wanted slip away because of your own choices, though he wasn't ready to frame it that way yet. What did you tell Miles? He asked, before I'd even fully opened the door. I told him the truth, because the truth was so mundane it was almost funny. I told him I'd mentioned that Sabrina seemed nice. That was it. That was all it took. One sentence dropped into a casual conversation, and the entire structure Weston had built around his teenage fixation had come apart because it had never been sturdy in the first place. It had been held together by nothing but Sabrina's obliviousness and everyone else's silence. He couldn't admit, standing in my doorway at 11 at night, why any of this bothered him without admitting what he'd done to me over the previous 2 months. So he did what people do when they're cornered by their own history. He softened. He sat down on the arm of my couch, voice suddenly gentle, and called me his girlfriend for the first time in a month, unprompted, like the word itself was a gift he was bestowing. You're my girlfriend, Naomi, he said. You know that. I asked him calmly why he'd denied that 3 times in front of other people if that's genuinely what I was to him. He blamed office dynamics for the happy hour. He blamed the chaos of Miles's birthday for the spare room lie. He said the barbecue was a company-only event and he hadn't thought I'd see the flyer, a claim that made it worse, not better, because it meant the lie hadn't been an accident of miscommunication. It had been a calculated bet that I wouldn't check. I told him I needed space. He promised he'd changed, that seeing Miles and Sabrina together had shown him something about himself he didn't like, that he wanted a real chance to fix things. I'd heard some version of that promise after the happy hour too, delivered in the same wrecked, sincere tone, and it had lasted exactly 3 weeks before the spare room lie. He texted me 31 times that week. I counted, the same way I'd counted the 11 minutes I stood holding his beer. Apologies. Old photos from the beginning of our relationship, croissant photos, a screenshot of a voice memo he'd apparently saved of me laughing at something months earlier, captions about good memories, about how he missed the version of us before all of this. I read every message and answered none of them. I buried myself in my thesis instead, in footnotes and data tables, and the specific relief of problems that had correct answers. Sabrina caught my arm in a parking lot after a group dinner about 10 days into that silence. It was the first time we'd spoken one-on-one since everything had unraveled. She looked uncertain, guarded, like she wasn't sure whether I'd want to talk to her at all. Can I ask you something? She said. Weston's been acting so strange since Miles and I got together. Does that have anything to do with you two? I could have lied. I could have protected Weston's dignity, the way I'd been protecting it for months without even fully realizing it. Instead, I told her the truth, plainly, without embellishment, because she deserved to know what she'd unknowingly been part of. 8 months, 3 public denials, a fake spare room, a barbecue he hid from me so he could have both of us in his life without either of us knowing about the other. Her face went pale in the parking lot light. She told me she'd thought his hovering at her desk over the past few weeks was just office friendliness, the kind of overly attentive coworker behavior you brush off because it seems harmless. Now she understood exactly what it had been. She apologized to me, genuinely, her voice shaking a little. I told her none of it was her fault. She hadn't asked for any of this. She just existed the way she'd existed in high school, oblivious to the weight Weston had assigned her. 2 days after that conversation, Weston texted me accusing me of sabotaging him, of turning Sabrina against him, of poisoning Miles's opinion of him. I looked at the message for a long time before I responded. I called him pathetic. He called me bitter. Neither of us apologized after that exchange, and the texting finally, mercifully, stopped. That weekend, I went dancing with a group of friends from my program. The first night out I'd allowed myself in weeks that wasn't shadowed by thinking about Weston. Someone posted a group photo afterward, 6 of us laughing under string lights, a man from another cohort standing at the edge of the frame, someone I'd talked to for maybe 10 minutes about a shared professor. Within the hour, Weston was texting again, demanding to know who the guy in the background was. The man who had spent months pretending I didn't exist in front of other people was suddenly, furiously invested in whether I might be moving on. That contradiction told me more about him than almost anything else in the entire saga. It wasn't really about me. It had never really been about me. It was about control, about being the one who decided when when the relationship existed and when it didn't, about wanting the exit and the ownership at the same time. We met one final time, at the coffee shop near campus where we'd had our third date, the one where he'd told me the story about Sabrina in high school like it was a closed chapter. He looked wrecked in a different way than he had at my door that night, hollower, more honest maybe, or at least closer to honest than he'd allowed himself to be up to that point. I keep thinking about high school, he said, wrapping both hands around a coffee cup he wasn't drinking from. Sabrina was never really about her, not even now. It was about the version of myself that finally got the girl who never looked at me twice. I think I've been chasing that version of myself since I was 15. I told him understanding why didn't undo what he'd done. Understanding is not the same as absolution, and I said as much, plainly, without cruelty. 3 denials, a fake spare room, a barbecue he'd hidden from me on purpose, betting correctly, at least twice, that I wouldn't find out. Those weren't accidents born out of panic. Panic explains one bad moment. It doesn't explain a pattern sustained across 2 months, each incident more calculated than the last. Those were choices, made over and over, about exactly where I ranked in his life, and the answer, every single time, had been beneath a woman who barely knew his last name until junior year. We broke up right there, at that table, under the same string of cafe lights that had once seemed romantic on our third date, and now just seemed like ordinary electrical fixtures doing an ordinary job. He handed back the spare key to my apartment without a word, sliding it across the table like a chess piece, conceding a match that had ended 2 moves earlier than either of us wanted to admit. I put it in my coat pocket and left first. I didn't look back to see his face. I'd already spent enough months studying it. Weeks passed. Miles and Sabrina's relationship moved with a kind of unhurried confidence that felt, at least from the outside, like exactly the opposite of everything that had come before it. They started apartment hunting together in early spring, looking at listings near the consulting firm where Sabrina worked, the kind of practical, grounded relationship milestone that Weston, for all his romantic obsession, had never once brought up with me in 8 months. Weston's social media went quiet for a while after the breakup, a silence that felt, at the time, like something approaching self-reflection. Then, without warning, it exploded with a vague post about growth, a black and white photo of a sunrise with a caption about becoming a better version of himself, the kind of post people write when they want an audience to witness a transformation they haven't actually undergone. I closed the app that day and didn't open it again for a long time. A friend still working at Weston's firm texted me a few weeks later, someone I'd met at that ill-fated happy hour and had stayed loosely in touch with since. She told me Weston had started therapy, something about self-worth issues, and that he'd taken to asking coworkers, apparently more than once, whether he'd really messed things up that badly with me. Nobody, she said, was giving him the answer he wanted to hear. Then came the revelation, and it arrived the way most true things do. Not through some dramatic confession, but through a small, mundane accident that Weston himself created. He texted in late April asking to come by my apartment to collect a few things he'd left behind over the course of the relationship. A jacket, a phone charger, a couple of textbooks he needed for a certification exam. I agreed, mostly because I wanted the closure of an empty closet more than I wanted to avoid seeing him. He came by on a Tuesday evening, distracted, apologetic in a low-grade way that had become his default setting around me, and while he dug through the hall closet for his jacket, he left his laptop open on my kitchen counter, still logged into his personal email, the same careless habit I'd noticed and filed away months earlier, back before any of this had happened, back when I'd hoped I would never need to use it. I want to be honest about the moment itself. I didn't plan it, but when I saw the inbox open on my counter, unattended, for the length of time it took him to find one jacket in a closet he used to visit twice a week, something in me made a decision faster than I could talk myself out of it. I scrolled. There was a folder, labeled with nothing more suspicious than a single letter, S, tucked near the bottom of his inbox sidebar. Inside it were drafts, dozens of them, going back nearly 2 years, most of them unsent, addressed to an email account I recognized instantly as Sabrina's, from a time long before she'd ever moved to our city, long before Weston and I had even met at that library table. Some were short, a paragraph, testing out sentences he never had the nerve to send. Some were longer, detailed accounts of his days, his frustrations at work, thoughts he apparently couldn't bring himself to share with anyone actually in his life, all addressed to a woman who, by his own admission, hadn't known his last name until junior year of high school. The most recent drafts were dated from the early months of our relationship, October, November, one from December, 2 days after our first date, in which he wrote about a girl in his program who reminded him a little of Sabrina, someone smart and a little guarded, someone he thought he might date for a while. He never named me in that one. He called me someone to pass the time with until things made more sense. Another draft from February, the same week as the reunion dinner with Priya, described me as nice enough and mentioned, almost as an aside, that he still checked Sabrina's public social media every few weeks just to see what she was up to. I sat on my kitchen floor with his laptop in my lap and read every single draft while he finished searching the closet, and by the time he came back into the kitchen, jacket in hand, I understood something I hadn't fully understood before. Sabrina moving to our city hadn't ignited some dormant, harmless nostalgia in him. It had been the answer to a years-long, ongoing correspondence he'd been having with an idea of her the entire time we were together. Drafts he composed and deleted and composed again, never brave enough to send, but never willing to stop writing either. I hadn't hadn't been the woman he loved who occasionally got distracted by an old crush. I had been, in his own words, someone to pass the time with until things made more sense. The relationship I'd believed in for 8 months had, to him, been a waiting room. I closed the laptop and didn't say anything about it that night. I let him leave with his jacket and his charger and his textbooks, and I sat in my apartment afterward, and finally, for the first time since the happy hour months earlier, I cried. Not out of heartbreak exactly. Out of something closer to grief for the version of the relationship I genuinely believed I was in. A relationship that, it turned out, had only ever existed on my side of the table. I took screenshots the next morning, once I'd calmed down enough to think clearly. I photographed every draft with dates and timestamps visible, careful, methodical, the way you document anything you needed a court or another person to believe without your word alone standing in for evidence. I didn't do it out of vengeance. I did it because I finally had proof of something I'd sensed for months, but could never fully articulate, that Weston's fixation on Sabrina wasn't an unfortunate reflex triggered by her arrival in our city. It was the organizing principle of his entire relationship with me, present from the very beginning, invisible until it wasn't. I debated for 2 days about what to do with what I'd found. In the end, I decided the people who deserved to know were the people Weston had lied to directly, in real rooms, in front of real witnesses. I sent the screenshots to Miles with a short message explaining what they were and when I'd found them. I told him he could do with them whatever he thought was right. I didn't send anything to Sabrina myself. I left that choice to Miles, because it was his relationship, his home, his roommate, and I'd already done enough unraveling of Weston's life without positioning myself as the one still pulling the threads. Miles called me that same night, his voice tight in a way I hadn't heard from him before. He told me he'd shown the screenshots to Sabrina. She'd gone quiet for a long time, he said, then asked to see the dates again, cross-referencing them against her own memory of when Weston had first started reaching out to her after she moved. The excuses he'd given for randomly texting an old high school acquaintance, the coffee he'd suggested for old time's sake, only 3 weeks after she'd relocated. It all lined up. He'd engineered every casual encounter she'd believed was coincidence. The confrontation happened 4 days later, not in a private conversation, but at a dinner Miles had already planned weeks earlier, a small gathering to celebrate Sabrina's promotion at the consulting firm, a dinner Weston had been invited to before any of this came out, back when he was still, technically, Miles's roommate and an old friend of the group. Nobody uninvited him. I think, in hindsight, Miles wanted him there specifically, so that what needed to be said could be said with witnesses. Weston arrived late, a little too cheerful, clearly unaware that the ground beneath him had already shifted. He'd barely sat down before Miles slid his phone across the table, screenshots pulled up, dates visible, and asked him flatly, in front of 4 other people from our old program, to explain what they were looking at. I watched Weston's face do the thing it had done at the happy hour all those months earlier, that same careful recalculation, except this time there was no story left to reach for. He tried anyway. He said the drafts were old, meaningless, things he'd never actually sent, practically insisting that the fact he never pressed send should count in his favor. Sabrina, sitting across the table with her promotion dinner going cold in front of her, asked him directly whether he'd started talking to her again, 3 weeks after she moved to the city, because he wanted to reconnect as a friend, or because he'd been composing emails to her for 2 years, while dating someone else entirely. He didn't have an answer that survived contact with the question. He said something about not meaning to hurt anyone, about it not being that deep, about people reading too much into private thoughts he'd never acted on. Sabrina, to her credit, didn't yell. She said quietly that she felt used, that she'd spent months feeling flattered by his attention, without understanding it had never really been about her as a person, only about a version of himself he wanted her to reflect back at him. Miles told him, in front of everyone, that he thought it was time he found somewhere else to live. I wasn't at that dinner. I heard about it secondhand, the same way I'd heard about most of the pivotal moments in this story. But this time, the secondhand account came with a kind of relief attached to it that none of the earlier ones had carried. For the first time, Weston's true character wasn't a secret only I was holding. It belonged now to a room full of people who had once liked him, who had once vouched for him, who now understood exactly what he was capable of when he thought no one was checking his math. The consequences spiraled outward faster than I expected, the way consequences do once the truth has an audience instead of a single skeptical witness. Weston moved out of Miles's apartment within 3 weeks, a scramble made harder by the fact that our city's rental market that spring was brutal, tight, competitive, and by the fact that he no longer had a roommate willing to vouch for him to potential landlords. He ended up in a studio across town, a 40-minute commute from his office, a detail I only know because our mutual friend at his firm mentioned it, unprompted, the way people mention things when they want you to know someone's life has gotten smaller. There was a security deposit dispute over the apartment he'd shared with Miles, a mundane, ugly little fight about $600 in damage to a bedroom wall Weston insisted predated his tenancy, and Miles insisted absolutely did not. It dragged out over a month of terse text exchanges, the kind of dispute that has nothing to do with the money and everything to do with 2 people who used to be close now looking for any excuse to be right about something. Miles eventually let it go, less because he'd changed his mind about the wall and more because, as he told me over coffee one afternoon, he didn't want one more month of his life organized around Weston. Family sides got chosen faster than anyone anyone expected too. Weston's mother, a woman named Carol who I'd spoken to over video calls a handful of times during our relationship and genuinely liked, texted me directly about 6 weeks after everything came apart. I hadn't expected to hear from her at all, let alone in the tone she used. She said she'd heard a version of events from Weston, a softened, self-serving version, and that it hadn't sat right with her, so she'd called Miles's mother, an old family friend from before either of our sons had left for college, and gotten a fuller picture. She apologized to me, on her son's behalf, in a message that was more honest about his character than anything he himself had managed to say. She told me she loved him but she wasn't proud of him, and that she hoped I was doing all right. I didn't expect to cry reading a text from my ex-boyfriend's mother, but I did, sitting on my kitchen floor in almost the exact spot where I'd once read his drafts to Sabrina. Weston's desperation showed up in smaller, stranger moves over the following weeks. He reached out to 2 of my closest friends from the program, people he barely knew, asking them to put in a good word with me, to explain that he wasn't a bad person, just someone who'd made mistakes under pressure. Both of them told me about the messages before responding, and both of them, at my request, simply didn't respond at all. He tried at one point to get Miles's forgiveness back by offering to help cover the deposit dispute out of his own pocket entirely, an offer Miles found more insulting than generous, since it read less like an apology and more like an attempt to buy back a friendship with the exact currency, money, that had never been the actual problem. He showed up unannounced outside my building once, in early May, standing on the sidewalk across the street for what a neighbor later told me was nearly 20 minutes before he finally left, without ever crossing over or ringing my buzzer. I found out about it after the fact, secondhand again, and felt less afraid than I expected, and more simply tired, the way you feel tired watching someone repeat a mistake they've already been told, in explicit terms, not to repeat. There was also the matter of a joint gym membership we'd signed up for together back in January, a 6-month contract at a boutique studio near campus that charged a $240 cancellation fee if you tried to break it early as an individual, rather than as a couple splitting the remaining balance. I spent an irritating 40 minutes on the phone with their billing department in April, explaining the situation to a customer service representative who clearly did not care, before they finally agreed to split the remaining balance between 2 separate accounts instead of holding me responsible for the whole thing. It was a small bureaucratic headache in the middle of a much larger emotional one, but I remember it distinctly because of how absurd it felt, arguing with a gym about a breakup while the actual breakup itself was still raw enough to make my hands shake when I picked up the phone. There was a logistical complication that took up more of my mental energy that spring than almost anything else, oddly enough, and it involved a wedding. A mutual friend from undergrad, someone both Weston and I had known since before either of us started grad school, was getting married in June, and Weston and I had bought plane tickets together back in February, back when 8 months felt like the beginning of something rather than the whole of it. We'd also put down a joint deposit, $400 on a shared hotel room, back when splitting costs for a weekend away had felt romantic instead of administrative. Untangling that deposit took 3 separate emails to the hotel, a refund policy that only partially covered our situation, and an awkward, necessary conversation with the bride herself, who ended up rearranging the entire wedding party's seating chart so Weston and I wouldn't be at adjacent tables. I ended up eating the cost of $120 I never got back, a small, specific loss that somehow felt more infuriating in the moment than almost anything else that spring, because it was so mundane, so far removed from the emotional wreckage, and yet it kept the wreckage present in my life in the form of an email thread I had to keep responding to for weeks. I want to talk about the quiet grief too, because I think stories like this one sometimes skip past it in favor of the satisfaction of watching someone get what they deserve, and I don't think that's honest. There was a night in late May, alone in my apartment, when I found an old voice memo on my phone, one Weston had apparently referenced in his texts weeks earlier, a recording from early in our relationship of me laughing at something he'd said while we cooked dinner together. I hadn't remembered saving it. I played it once, sitting on my kitchen floor for what felt like the 100th time that spring, and I let myself miss him. Not the version of him who'd stood in front of Sabrina at a happy hour and called me nobody. The other one. The one who used to bring croissants on Fridays without being asked, who'd learned my coffee order without repeating the question, who I genuinely believed for most of a year was someone worth building a life around. That grief didn't cancel out everything I'd learned about who he actually was underneath the croissants and the careful attentiveness, but it existed alongside the anger, the relief, the grim satisfaction of watching consequences finally catch up to him. Both things were true at once. I'd lost something real, even if the thing I'd lost had never been quite what I thought it was. By the time August rolled around, the group chat that used to include all of us, Weston, Miles, Sabrina, me, and half a dozen mutual friends from the program, had quietly split into 2. Weston kept in touch with a shrinking handful of coworkers and 1 or 2 old friends who hadn't been in the room for any of the worst of it. Everyone else, without any formal announcement, simply stopped including him. Nobody organized a boycott. It just happened the way social gravity happens, people drifting toward the version of events that matched what they'd actually witnessed. Our mutual friend from Weston's office texted me one more time that summer, in July, saying Weston had started therapy in earnest, no longer the vague, performative version he'd mentioned in the spring, but something something that sounded more consistent, more serious. She said he'd started asking fewer questions about whether he'd messed up and had started instead asking what he was supposed to do differently. I didn't feel triumphant reading that message. I felt, mostly, like it was information about a stranger's life, someone I used to know well and now only understood through the reports of other people, which is, I think, the truest marker of how completely something has ended. 6 months after the confrontation dinner, our old program's cohort organized a group dinner of its own, the kind of loosely recurring gathering that had continued on and off since we'd all graduated or were finishing our final semesters. I went because most of my closest friends were going, because I no longer organized my social calendar around avoiding Weston's presence in a room, because enough time had passed that I trusted myself to sit across a table from him without my hands shaking. Weston walked in with someone new on his arm, a woman I didn't recognize, someone from outside our old program entirely. I felt something when I saw them together, but it wasn't the collapse I might have predicted 6 months earlier. It was closer to nothing. Real, calm, unremarkable nothing. The kind of feeling that only arrives once you fully finished processing something. Once a person's presence in a room no longer rearranges your nervous system. 2 weeks after that dinner, Miles called another gathering, smaller this time, just the core group, and stood up near the end of the meal with Sabrina's hand in his, and made an announcement that changed the entire tenor of the room. Weston, sitting at the far end of the table, went completely still the second he heard it, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, his face doing that same careful recalculation I'd watched him do at the happy hour almost a year earlier, except this time there was no fantasy left for him to retreat into, no old crush to chase, no room full of people willing to give him the benefit of the doubt one more time. There was fallout at Weston's office, too, quieter than the fallout among our friend group, but no less real. The happy hour and the barbecue had both been company events, which meant a decent number of his co-workers had a front row seat to at least fragments of what happened, even if they didn't understand the full shape of it at the time. Our mutual friend there told me that once word started circulating, in the vague, half-accurate way office gossip always circulates, a few people who'd previously included Weston in lunch plans and after-work drinks quietly stopped extending the invitations. Nobody confronted him about it directly. It just got a little colder around his desk, a little quieter. The specific social erosion that happens when people decide, without ever announcing it, that they'd rather not be closely associated with someone. My own family found out gradually, the way families do, through the kind of phone calls where you say more than you meant to because someone asks the right question at the right moment. My mother had liked Weston, in the cautious way mothers like the people their daughters bring home, and when I finally told her the full version of events, months after it happened, she went quiet on the phone for a long moment before saying she wished I'd told her sooner. I told her I hadn't wanted to worry her while I was still in the middle of it, still trying to figure out for myself what was actually happening before I asked anyone else to carry the weight of it with me. She understood that, or said she did, and asked instead whether I was doing all right now, which felt like the more useful question anyway. My two closest friends from the program, a woman named Priya, unrelated to the Priya from Weston's college reunion, and another named Deja, who'd been in my cohort since our first semester, became something like a support system I hadn't fully appreciated needing until I needed it. Deja was the one who sat with me the night I read Weston's drafts, driving over unannounced after I texted her something vague and upset, staying until well past midnight while I talked in circles trying to make sense of what I'd found. She didn't tell me what to do with the information. She just sat with me while I decided, which, looking back, was exactly the kind of support that mattered most, the kind that doesn't rush you toward a decision before you're ready to make it. Miles proposed in September, on the same rooftop bar where Sabrina had first posted their photo together the previous fall, a detail that felt less like coincidence and more like the natural closing of a loop. Sabrina cried before he'd even finished the sentence. The table erupted into the kind of noise a group makes when they've been rooting for something without saying it out loud. Chairs scraping, someone's water glass tipping over in the commotion, 4 separate phones raised to capture the moment from 4 separate angles. Weston didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was a quiet, flat congratulations, offered a full 10 seconds after everyone else's, the kind of delay that told the whole table exactly how much it cost him to say it at all. He left before dessert arrived, citing an early morning the next day that nobody at the table quite believed. I watched him go, watched the door close behind him, and felt the same calm nothing I'd felt seeing him with his new girlfriend 2 weeks earlier. Except this time it had an edge of something almost like pity attached to it. The specific, complicated pity you feel for someone who spent a decade chasing the wrong ghost and only fully understood it once the ghost had built a life with someone else. I think about that night often, not because I feel sorry for Weston in any way that resembles forgiveness, but because it crystallized something I'd been circling for the better part of a year. Weston never actually wanted Sabrina. Not really. Not as a person with her own preferences and flaws and a laugh that carried across rooms. He wanted what she represented, a 15-year-old's proof that he was worth choosing. He spent a decade writing drafts he never sent to a version of her that existed only in his head, and when the real woman finally arrived in his life, she chose someone else almost immediately, someone who'd never needed to prove anything to her, because he'd never spent a decade building a fantasy around her in the first place. Miles just liked her. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, in a way, that nothing Weston Weston had ever done with me had managed to be enough. I finished my graduate program the following spring, a year after the happy hour that started all of this, a year after I stood in a bar parking lot doing math on a steering wheel instead of crying. I took a policy job in a different city, a decision I'd been circling for a while before any of this happened, but that took on a new kind of clarity once I no longer had a relationship anchoring me to a specific zip code. I kept in touch with Miles and Sabrina, who I still consider two of the closest friends this whole ordeal left me with. An odd but genuine outcome given how the three of us first became entangled. I was at their wedding the following summer, seated at a table nowhere near an ex-boyfriend this time, because there wasn't one in attendance to seat carefully around. I still think about the version of Weston I met at that library table sometimes, the one who slid a croissant across the table without a word because he'd noticed I'd skipped lunch 3 days running. I don't think that version of him was entirely fake. I think it was real, in the specific narrow way a person can be real when Sabrina isn't in the room, when his sense of self isn't being measured against a decade-old rejection he never fully processed. But real in narrow moments isn't the same as reliable, and reliable is what a relationship actually requires, day after day, in rooms full of people who aren't the specific person capable of derailing your sense of self-worth. I learned that difference the hard way, and I don't think I could have learned it any other way. Not from a warning, not from advice, only from living through 8 months of croissants and 3 public denials, and finally understanding that both of those things had come from the same person at the same time, and neither one had been more true than the other. People ask me sometimes, when this story comes up, whether I regret what I did, whether planting one sentence in a coffee conversation with Miles counts as manipulation, whether turning Weston's fantasy against him makes me not so different from him in the end. I've thought about that question honestly, more than once, sitting with it instead of dismissing it, because I think it deserves an honest answer rather than a defensive one. Here's what I've landed on. I didn't create anything that wasn't already there. I didn't fabricate a version of Sabrina that didn't exist, or lie to Miles about her, or manufacture a story out of nothing. I told the truth about a woman I found genuinely likable in a conversation that would have happened with or without me, because Miles was going to notice Sabrina eventually, regardless of anything I said. What I did was stop protecting Weston from the natural consequences of his own choices. I stopped covering for him in front of people who deserved to know what he was actually doing, and once I stopped covering, the truth did the rest of the work on its own. That's not manipulation. That's just what happens when you finally let a room see what's already in it. I don't say that to claim I was some kind of righteous architect of justice. I was a 26-year-old woman who'd been humiliated in public 3 separate times by a person who claimed to love her, and I found a way to stop absorbing that humiliation quietly. If there's a difference between what I did and what Weston did, it's this. Weston built his entire relationship with me around a lie of omission, letting me believe I mattered more than I actually did in his internal hierarchy. I never lied to anyone. I just stopped being the only person who knew the truth. There's a specific kind of peace that comes from watching someone's carefully constructed story collapse under its own weight, rather than under any external force you had to manufacture. I didn't destroy Weston's life. Weston destroyed his own credibility, one denial at a time, one barbecue photo at a time, one unsent draft email at a time, and all I did was stop being the last obstacle standing between his choices and the people who deserve to see them clearly. I won't pretend the ending is entirely happy though, because I don't think honest stories get to end that cleanly, and I promised myself, somewhere in the middle of writing all of this down, that I'd tell it the way it actually happened rather than the way it would feel most satisfying to tell. Something real was lost in all of this, even if what I lost turned out to be less than what I originally believed I had. I lost 8 months. I can't get back. 8 months I spent believing in a version of partnership that only existed in the hours when a ghost from someone's adolescence wasn't in the room. I lost the easy, uncomplicated trust I used to extend to people by default, the kind of trust that doesn't ask for proof before believing someone loves you the way they say they do. I've had to rebuild that trust slowly, carefully, in the 2 relationships I've had since, and I'm not sure it will ever come back in quite the same shape it had before that happy hour, before I learned to count minutes, standing at a bar holding a beer nobody wanted. I started seeing a therapist that fall, too, not because anyone told me to, but because I noticed I was still doing the math, still counting things automatically the way I'd counted the 11 minutes at the happy hour, the 31 texts, the $400 on a hotel deposit I never got back. My therapist pointed out gently in one of our early sessions that counting had become my way of turning something chaotic and humiliating into something I could quantify, something with edges, something that felt manageable even when the actual experience hadn't been. She asked me once whether I thought I needed Weston to lose everything in order to feel like I'd been believed. I sat with that question for a long time before I answered honestly. I told her no, not anymore, though I suspected that hadn't always been true. In the early weeks, right after the happy hour, I think some smaller, more wounded part of me did want exactly that, wanted a scoreboard, wanted proof visible enough that no one, including myself, could ever again wonder if I'd exaggerated what happened to me. By the time Miles and Sabrina got engaged, I didn't need the scoreboard anymore. What I felt watching Weston's face go still at that table wasn't triumph so much as recognition, the simple, unglamorous relief of watching cause finally meet effect in a way that didn't didn't require me to keep narrating it for anyone. I'd spent 8 months being told implicitly and explicitly that I was replaceable, optional, a placeholder in someone else's unfinished story. Watching him sit at that table, uninvited from the center of the very narrative he'd spent a decade trying to write himself into, felt less like revenge and more like the universe finally agreeing with something I'd known for a long time and had been too polite for too long to say out loud. I think about the croissants sometimes, still, on Friday mornings, an involuntary little flicker of memory that shows up whether I want it to or not. I don't think that flicker will ever fully disappear, and I've stopped expecting it to. Grief doesn't announce an end date. It just gets quieter, less frequent, easier to sit with, until one day you realize you can hold the memory of something good alongside the knowledge of how it actually ended, without either one erasing the other. Weston called me a stranger to impress a girl who barely remembered his last name, and in the end, it was that same reflex, that same decade-old hunger to be chosen by someone who'd never really seen him, that cost him nearly everyone who actually did. I didn't have to destroy anything to make that happen. I only had to stop being quiet about what I'd already watched him build, one careless denial at a time, in rooms full of people who were only ever waiting for permission to see it too. I think that's the truest thing I can tell you about what happened. Not that I got some perfect, cinematic revenge, and not that everything worked out exactly as it should have, but that telling the truth plainly to the people who deserved to hear it turned out to be more powerful than anything I could have engineered on my own. Weston spent a decade writing drafts to a fantasy he never had the courage to send. I spent 8 months learning that the truth, once you finally let it out of your hands, doesn't need much help finding its way to exactly where it belongs.